The story of a common soldier of Army life in the Civil War, 1861 to 1865 by Leander Stillwell is a vivid first-hand account of an ordinary Union soldier's journey from enlistment to the harsh realities of battle and camp life. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe. These are Stillwell's words. Let's begin. The invasion of Tennessee by the Confederate Army under the command of General J.B. Hood was now underway, and only a day or two after our arrival at Murfreesboro, we began to hear the sullen, deep-toned booming of artillery toward the west, and later northwest, in the direction of Nashville. This continued, with more or less frequency, until the termination of the Battle of Nashville on December 16, which resulted in the defeat of the Confederates and their retreat from the state. Around December 3, the Confederate cavalry, under the command of our old acquaintance, General N.B. Forrest, swung in between Nashville and Murfreesboro, tore up the railroad, and cut us off from Nashville for about 2 weeks. The Union forces at Murfreesboro at this time consisted of about 6,000 men, infantry, cavalry, and artillery, but principally infantry, under the command of General L. H. Rousseau. December 4, 1864, was a pleasant, beautiful day at Old Murfreesboro. The sun was shining bright and warm, the air was still, and the weather conditions were like those at home during an Indian summer in October. Around the middle of the afternoon, without a single note of preliminary warning, suddenly came the heavy boom of cannon close at hand, in a northwesterly direction. We at once ran up on the ramparts, and looking up the railroad toward Nashville, could plainly see the blue rings of powder smoke curling upwards above the trees. But we did not look long. Directly after we heard the first report, the bugles in our camp and others began sounding "fall in." We hastily formed in line, and in a very short time, the 61st Illinois and 2 other regiments of infantry, the 8th Minnesota and the 174th Ohio, with a section of artillery, all under the command of General R. H. Milroy, filed out of Fortress Rosecrans and proceeded in the direction of the cannonading. About 4 miles out from Murfreesboro, we came to the scene of the trouble. The Confederates had opened with their artillery on one of our railroad blockhouses and were trying to demolish or capture it. The 13th Indiana Cavalry had preceded us to the spot and was skirmishing with the enemy. Our regiment formed in line on the right of the pike, the Minnesota Regiment to our right, and the Ohio Regiment on the left, while our artillery took a position on some higher ground near the pike and began exchanging shots with that of the enemy. The position of our regiment was on the hither slope of a somewhat high ridge, in the woods, with a small stream called Overall's Creek running parallel to our front. We were standing here at ease, doing nothing, and I slipped up on the crest of the ridge to see what I could see. The ground on the opposite side of the creek was lower than ours and was open, except for a growth of rank grass and weeds. I could plainly see the skirmishers of the enemy, dressed in butternut clothing, skulking in the grass and weeds, and occasionally firing in our direction. They looked real tempting, so I hurried back to the regiment and, going to Captain Keeley, told him that the Confederate skirmishers were just across the creek in plain sight and asked if I could slip down the brow of the ridge and take a few shots at them. He looked at me kind of queerly and said, "You stay right where you are and tend to your own business. You'll have plenty of shooting before long." I felt a little hurt at his remark but made no reply and resumed my place in the ranks. However, he later made a sort of apology for his brusque reproof, saying he had no desire to see me perhaps throw my life away in a performance not within the scope of my proper and necessary duty. And he was right, too, in his prediction that there would soon be plenty of shooting. I had just taken my place in the ranks when a mounted staff officer came galloping up and, accosting a little group of our line officers, asked, with a strong German accent, "ISS this the 61st Illinois?" Upon being told that it was, he next inquired for Colonel Grass, who was pointed out to him. He rode to the colonel, saluted, and said, "Colonel Grass, the General sends his compliments with the orders that you immediately deploy your regiment as skirmishers, and forthwith advance on the enemy, right in your front." The recruits and non-veterans of the regiment were still in Arkansas, so our present effective strength hardly exceeded 300 men. This meant that we had just about enough to make a sufficient skirmish line for the rest of the command. In obedience to the order, the regiment was promptly deployed as skirmishers, and the line advanced over the crest of the ridge in our front and down the slope on the opposite side. At the bank of the creek, a little incident befell me, which serves to show how a very trifling thing may play an important part in one's fate. I happened to reach the creek at a point opposite a somewhat deep pool. The water was clear and cold, and I disliked the idea of having wet feet on the skirmish line, so I looked around for a place to cross dry shod. A rod or two above me, the stream was narrow and could be jumped, so I started and run for that place. The creek bank on my side was made of yellow clay, high and perpendicular, while on the opposite side, the bank was quite low, with the ground sloping upward gently. While running along the edge of the stream to the fording place, one of my feet caught on the end of a dead root projecting from the lower edge of the bank, and I pitched forward, nearly falling. At that very instant, thud, into the clay bank right opposite where I would have been standing, went a bullet fired by a Confederate skirmisher. He had probably taken deliberate aim at me and, upon seeing me almost fall headlong, doubtless gave himself credit for another Yankee sent to the happy hunting grounds. It is quite likely that owing to the existence of that old dead root and my lucky stumble, I am here now telling the story of this skirmish. By this time, it was sunset, and darkness was approaching, but we went on. The Confederate skirmishers retired, but we soon encountered their main line on some high ground near the edge of the woods, and then we had to stop. We lay down, loaded, and fired from that position, and nearly all of the enemy's bullets passed over our heads. Presently, it grew quite dark, and all we had to aim at was the long horizontal sheet of red flame that streamed from the Confederates' muskets. Meanwhile, the artillery of both parties continued their duel, with balls and shells screaming over our heads. Occasionally, a Confederate shell would explode right above us, looking interesting but causing no harm. While all this firing was at its liveliest, I heard close by the heavy thud of a bullet striking a human body, followed immediately by a sharp cry of "Oh!" which meant that someone had been hit. It proved to be Lieutenant Elijah Corrington, of Company F. He was struck by the ball in the region of the heart and expired almost instantly. He was a good man and a brave soldier, and his death was sincerely mourned. The affair was terminated by the 174th Ohio on our left, getting around on the enemy's right flank, where it poured in a destructive volley, and the Confederates retired. We followed a short distance but neither saw nor heard anything more of the enemy, so we finally withdrew as well. We recrossed the creek, built some big fires out of dry chestnut rails, which we left burning, in order, I suppose, to make our foes believe we were still there, and then marched to Murfreesboro, where we arrived about midnight. On the 2 following days, December 5th and 6th, the Confederates showed themselves to the west of us and demonstrated most ostentatiously against Murfreesboro. From where we stood on the ramparts of Fortress Rosecrans, we could plainly see their columns in motion, with flags flying, circling around us as if looking for a good opening. They were beyond the range of musketry, but our big guns in the fortress opened on them and gave them a most noisy cannonading. What effect this had, I don't know, probably not much. In the battles of the Civil War, artillery playing on infantry at short range with grape and canister did frightful execution, of which I saw plenty of evidence at Shiloh. But at a distance, firing with solid shot or shell simply made a big noise, and if it killed anybody, it was more an accident than anything else. Beginning about December 5th and continuing for several days thereafter, we turned out at 4 o'clock every morning, fully armed, and manned the trenches in the rear of the breastworks, remaining there until after sunrise. It was a cold, chilly business, standing 2 or 3 hours in those damp trenches, with an empty stomach, waiting for an apprehended attack, which, however, was never made. For my part, I felt as I did when behind our big works in the rear of Vicksburg and sincerely hoped that the other fellows would make an attempt to storm our defenses. I think the other boys felt the same way. We would have shot them down just like pigeons, and the artillery in the corner bastions, charged with grape and canister, would have played its part too. But the Confederates had no intention of making any such attempt. The official records of the rebellion contain the correspondence between Hood and Forrest concerning this movement on Murfreesboro, which clearly discloses their schemes. The plan was simply to scare Rousseau out of Murfreesboro and cause him to retreat northward toward the town of Lebanon. Then, having drawn him out of his stronghold, they intended to surround him in the open with their large force of cavalry, well supported by infantry, and capture his entire command. But Rousseau didn't scare worth a cent, as will appear later. Early in the morning of December 7th, General Rousseau sent out General Milroy with 7 regiments of infantry, which included our regiment, a battery of artillery, and a small detachment of cavalry to find out what General Forrest wanted. Our entire force consisted of a little over 3,300 men. We first marched south from Murfreesboro on the Salem Pike but gradually executed a right wheel, crossed Stone River, and worked to the northwest. We soon encountered the Confederate cavalry vedette, and a portion of the 61st was thrown out as skirmishers, working with our cavalry to drive back these scattered outposts of the enemy. Finally, around noon, we ran up against the main line of the Confederates on the Wilkinson Pike, where they were protected by slight and hastily constructed breastworks made of dirt, rails, and logs. Their artillery opened on us before we came within musket range, and we halted, forming in line of battle in some tall woods with an open field in front. We were standing in line when General Milroy, with some of his staff, rode up right in front of our regiment and stopped on a small elevated piece of ground. Then the old man took out his field glass and carefully, deliberately scrutinized the country before him. My place in the line was only a few yards away, and I watched his proceedings with the deepest interest. He would look a while at the front, then sweep his glass to the right and scan that area, then to the left and examine that region. While he was engaged in this survey, we all remained profoundly silent. His staff sat near him on their horses, also saying nothing. His observation of the country could not have lasted more than 5 minutes, but to me, it seemed terribly long. At last, he shut up his glass, returned it to its case, gave his horse a slight pull, and said something in a low tone to the different members of his staff, who immediately dispersed in a gallop up and down our line. Now, I thought, something is going to happen. One of the staff officers stopped and spoke to Colonel Grass, and then came the command. Attention, battalion. Shoulder arms. Face to the rear. Battalion, about face. Right shoulder shift arms. Forward, guide center, march. And that, I thought, told the story. The other fellows were too many for us, and we were going to back out. They must have had someone up a tree watching us, for we had hardly begun our rearward movement before their artillery opened on us furiously. Cannonballs went crashing through the tree tops, bringing down limbs in profusion. But, as usual, the artillery hurt nobody, and we moved on, quietly and in perfect order. After retiring through the woods for some distance, we gradually changed the direction of our march to the left, executing an extensive left wheel and pivoting toward the left flank of the enemy. Here, our entire regiment was deployed as skirmishers, and we advanced once more. We later learned that the enemy had made all their preparations to meet us at the point where we first encountered their line, so they were not fully prepared for this new movement. General Milroy, in his official report of the battle, describing this advance, stated, "The 61st Illinois was deployed as skirmishers in front of the first line, and the line advanced upon the enemy through the brush, cedars, rocks, and logs, under a heavy fire of artillery. Skirmishing with small arms began soon after commencing my advance, but my skirmish line advanced rapidly, bravely, and in splendid order, considering the nature of the ground, driving the rebels before them for about a mile, when their main line was struck. As we were advancing in this skirmish line across an old cotton field, the Confederates ran forward a section of artillery, placed it on some rising ground, and opened on us with rapid fire. The shot and shell fell all around us, throwing up showers of red dirt, but doing no harm. While these guns were engaged, I noticed a large, fine-looking man, mounted on an iron-gray horse, near one of the pieces. He was intently watching our advance across the field. He was clearly a Confederate officer, and I thought possibly of high rank. Taking careful aim each time, I fired 2 shots from Trime Thicket, the pet name of my old musket, but without effect, so far as I could tell. After each shot, he remained impassive in his saddle and soon after galloped away. After the battle, I discussed the incident with some of the Confederates we had captured, and they told me that this officer was General Forrest himself. He was probably too far away when I fired at him for my shots to be effective, but he doubtless heard the bullets and perhaps decided that he had better not expose himself unnecessarily. Our skirmish line continued to advance across the cotton field previously mentioned. In our front was a dense thicket of small cedars occupied by the Confederate skirmishers, and as we approached these woods, our progress was somewhat slow. I happened to notice, at the edge of the thicket and only a few yards in front of me, a big, heavy log lying parallel to our line, which would afford splendid protection. Without hesitation, I made a rush and dropped behind it. It appeared to be a rail cut and had been left lying on the ground. A little fellow from Company H, named John Fox, who was a year or 2 younger than me, saw me rush for the log, followed me, and dropped down behind it as well. He had hardly done so when he quickly called out, "Look out, Stillwell. You'll get shot." I hardly understood what had prompted his warning, but instinctively ducked behind the log. At that very instant, whish, a bullet from the front tore through the upper bark of the log, right where my chest had been a second before, scattering worm dust and fragments of bark over my neck and shoulders. "I seen him taken aim," John remarked dryly. "Where is he?" I quickly inquired. "Right yonder," answered Fox, pointing to the spot. I looked and saw the fellow, a grown man in a faded gray uniform, but before I could finish my hasty preparations to return his compliment, he disappeared into the jungle of cedars. An incident occurred soon after that was, at the time, very mortifying to me and, to this day, remains something I have never been able to understand or explain. We had passed through the cedar woods and entered another old cotton field. Right at the near edge of that field, we came upon a Confederate cavalry vidette seated on his horse. The man had possibly been on duty all the previous night and may have been dozing in his saddle, or he never would have allowed us to slip up on him as we did. But if he was asleep, he woke up promptly at this stage of the proceedings. All along our line, the boys began firing at him, yelling as they did so. The moment I saw him, I thought to myself, with an exultant thrill, "You're my game." He was a big fellow, broad across the back, wearing a wool hat, a gray jacket, and butternut trousers. My gun was loaded, I was all ready, and what followed didn't take much more than 2 seconds. I threw my gun to my shoulder, let the muzzle settle until I saw through the front and rear sights the center of that broad back, and then pulled the trigger. Lowering my musket, I looked eagerly to the front, absolutely confident that my vision would settle on a horse flying riderless across the field, with the soldier lying dead on the ground. But to my utter amazement, there he was, still on his horse, and, like John Gilpin of old, going like an arrow swift, shot by an archer strong. He had a small gad, or switch, in his right hand, with which he was furiously belaboring his horse at every jump. The upshot of the matter was that he reached the woods beyond and disappeared without a scratch, so far as any of us on our side ever knew. How my shot happened to miss that man remains one of the most unaccountable things that has ever happened to me in my life. I was perfectly cool and collected at the time, my nerves were steady as iron, he was a splendid mark at close range, and I took a deadly aim. And yet, I missed him. And then, to think that all our other fellows missed him too. It was certainly something beyond comprehension. Now, as I write these lines, more than half a century has passed since that incident occurred. I will record here that I am sincerely thankful that I failed to kill that man. Considering his miraculous escape, it is quite possible that he lived through the war, married a good woman, and became the father of a family of fine children. Perhaps one of his boys even fought under the old flag in the Spanish-American War, so maybe it was all for the best. But still, how in the world did I happen to miss him? Only a few minutes after this, I experienced what was likely the closest call I had during my service. On this day, Company D happened to be assigned a position on the extreme right of the skirmish line. This was not the usual place for the company in the regimental line, and I don't know exactly how it came about, but that's how it was. As the first sergeant of Company D, my position was on the extreme right of the company, meaning I was the right-hand man of the entire skirmish line. We were continuing our advance across the field where we had encountered the vidette and were all in high spirits. I was wearing a broad-brimmed felt hat, my overcoat, and beneath that, what we called a dress coat, with the ends of my trouser legs tucked into my socks. I was carrying my gun at the ready, eagerly looking for something to shoot at. A little bunch of Confederates in the woods on our right was taking occasional shots at us, but we paid them no attention since the main force of the enemy was directly ahead. Suddenly, I was whirled around on my feet like a top, and a sensation shot through me similar, I suppose, to an electric shock. I noticed that the breast of my overcoat was torn, but I saw no blood and felt no pain, so I knew I wasn't hurt. It was clear that the bullet had come from the right, so some of us finally paid attention to those fellows, and they soon disappeared. After the battle, I examined my clothes to find out exactly what the bullet had done. It had entered from the right, first passing through the cape of my overcoat, then through the right sleeve of both my overcoat and dress coat, then through the right breast of both coats, then through the left breast, and from there, it went on its way. All told, it had made 9 holes in my clothes, but never touched my flesh. But it was a fine line shot, and had it been 2 inches further back, all would have been over for me. Just after this episode, as we approached a rise in the field, we came in sight of the main line of the enemy, positioned at the edge of the woods on the opposite side. The right wing of our skirmish line then took ground to the right, while the other wing moved to the left in order to uncover our main line. The main line then marched up, and the action became general. The musketry fire on both sides was heavy and incessant, and, in addition, the enemy had a battery of artillery, which kept roaring most furiously. We also had a battery, but it was not in action at this point. As we later learned, it had exhausted its ammunition earlier in the day and had returned to Fortress Rosecrans for a fresh supply. However, before it could get back, the fight was over. The engagement had lasted only a short time when the command was given to charge, and our whole line moved forward. At that moment, I witnessed the bravest act I ever saw performed by an officer of the rank of general. The regiment immediately to the left of the right wing of our regiment was the 174th Ohio. It was a new regiment and had only been under fire once before, 3 days prior, at the affair at Overalls Creek. As we started the charge, I anxiously watched this big, green Ohio regiment, for it was perfectly clear that if they faltered and fell back, our little right wing of the 61st Illinois would have to do the same. And then, suddenly, that Ohio regiment stopped. And we stopped too. I looked at those Ohio men. There was that peculiar trembling, wavy motion along their line, the unmistakable sign of an imminent collapse. It seemed like the game was up. But just at that supreme moment, old General Milroy appeared on his horse, right in front of the Ohio regiment, at a point opposite their colors. He was bareheaded, holding his hat in his right hand, his long, heavy, iron-gray hair streaming in the wind. He was a most conspicuous mark. The Confederates were blazing away along their entire line, yelling like demons, and I held my breath, fully expecting to see the old general pitch headlong from his horse, riddled with bullets. But he gave the enemy very little time to practice on him. I was not close enough to hear what he said, but in a ringing tone, he called out to those Ohio men and waved his hat toward the enemy. The effect was instantaneous and sublime. The whole line surged forward with a furious yell, crashing over the Confederate works like a great blue wave, and the day was ours. The Confederates retreated at a double quick but in good order. We captured 2 pieces of their artillery, a stand of colors, and about 200 prisoners. We pursued them a short distance but saw them no more, and around sundown, we marched back to Fortress Rosecrans. Before leaving this affair behind, there are a few more things worth mentioning. As we went over the Confederate works in our charge, I saw lying on the ground inside the breastworks a dead Confederate lieutenant colonel. He was on his back, his broad-brimmed hat pulled over his face, with a pair of large gauntlet gloves tucked into his belt. His sword was detached from the belt, still in its scabbard, and lay across his body. As I ran by him, I stooped down, grabbed the sword with my left hand, and carried it along. I took it back to camp with me, kept it until we were mustered out, and then brought it home. Later, a Masonic lodge was organized in Otterville, and some of the officers borrowed the sword from me for use by the Tyler in his official duties. In 1868, I moved to Kansas, leaving the sword with the lodge. Some years later, when I wished to reclaim it as a relic of the war, I discovered that the lodge building, along with all its furniture and paraphernalia, including the sword, had been accidentally destroyed by fire. Thus, the only battlefield trophy I ever carried off was lost forever. Many years later, in Kansas, I met the late Confederate General John B. Gordon of Georgia and had a long, interesting conversation with him. I told him the story of how I had obtained the sword and its eventual loss. He listened intently, and at the close of my account, he said he was satisfied that the dead Confederate officer was W. W. Billup, Lieutenant Colonel of the 29th Georgia, who had been killed in this action. General Gordon said he had been well acquainted with Colonel Billup during his lifetime and described him as a splendid gentleman and a brave soldier. I have always regretted the loss of that sword, for when I first sought to reclaim it from the Masonic Lodge, I had intended to take steps to return it to the family of the fallen officer, if possible. When the Confederates retreated from the battlefield on December 7, they left behind their dead and severely wounded, as they had no means to carry them away. I walked among the wounded and fallen and saw things that made me sorrowful indeed. I looked inside the haversacks of some of the dead to see what they had to eat, and what do you suppose I found? Nothing but raw, shelled corn. Many of them were barefoot, and judging from appearances, had been so for quite some time. Their feet were almost as black as those of a Negro, with the skin wrinkled and corrugated like the hide of an alligator. These things inspired in me a respect for the Confederate soldiers that I had never felt before. The political leaders, men like Jefferson Davis and Robert Toombs, who had unnecessarily brought about the war are, in my opinion, deserving of the severest condemnation. But there can be no doubt that the common soldiers of the Confederate Army fought from a deep-seated conviction in the justice and righteousness of their cause. The fortitude and bravery they displayed in support of it are worthy of the highest admiration. After the engagement of December 7th, the Confederates still lingered in our vicinity, occasionally showing themselves, but making no aggressive movements. Cold weather set in around this time, covering the ground with sleet, and our situation, cooped up inside Fortress Rosecrans, became unpleasant and miserable. We had long since turned in our big Sibley tents and drawn instead what we called pup tents. These were small, squatty things, made of different sections of canvas that could be unbuttoned, taken apart, and carried by the men when on the march. They were only large enough for 2 occupants, and unlike the Sibley tents, they had no facilities for building fires inside. To make matters worse, since the Confederates surrounded us, we were short on firewood. Stone River ran through the fortress, and there were some large logs in the water, likely there since the work was constructed. We dragged them out and used them to eke out our fires. They were waterlogged and barely did more than smolder, but they helped some. At night, we crowded into those little pup tents, lay down with all our clothes on, wrapped ourselves in blankets, and tried to sleep, but with little success. I remember that usually, around midnight, I would freeze out, get up, stand around those smoldering, sobbing logs, and shiver. To make matters even worse, we were put on half rations shortly after arriving at Murfreesboro, and full rations were not issued again until the Confederates retreated from Nashville after the Battle of December 15th to 16th. That concludes the 16th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.